All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jeff Horrell. I'm Dean of Libraries here at Dartmouth. And it is a pleasure for me to welcome all of you on behalf of the Friends of the Dartmouth Library to the 17th Stephen Harvard Memorial Lecture. Thank you all for coming out on this 14-degree day and coming from so far. I understand there are folks here from Chicago and many of the New England states, so it's great to have you all. We are delighted today to welcome Douglas Scott as our speaker on the work of Alvin Eisenman, Dartmouth class of 1943, and post-World War II graphic design. Eisenman, by coincidence, not really a coincidence, presented the Stephen Harvard Lecture in 1992. We are honored this afternoon to have Mrs. Eisenman with us, and I learned at lunch today that she actually worked here in Baker Library earlier in her career, and it's a pleasure for us to have you here with us, as well as her daughter, Sarah, and her husband, David Godine, class of 1966, and their daughter, Maddie, sitting next to her mother there, and a number of friends and colleagues of Alvin Eisenman. We're also very pleased that I believe Paula Harvard, is Paula here? Is Paula? There she is, thank you. And her husband, Regis Tremblay, could be here this afternoon as well. In 1989, friends, classmates, and colleagues of Stephen Harvard, class of 1970, established the Stephen Harvard Memorial Lecture Series to honor the gifted typographer and graphic designer. During his Dartmouth years, Harvard was a student of Ray Nash in the Graphic Arts Workshop, now called the Book Arts Workshop. Following his graduation from Dartmouth, he worked as a professional stone cutter, of which a number of examples grace various locations in Baker Library. He subsequently began a career at Meriden Steinhauer Press as a book designer, calligrapher, and illustrator. He was the creator of the illustrations for Noel Perrin's memoir, First Person Rural, published by David R. Godine. In the latter part of a much too abbreviated life and career, he began an association with Adobe Systems, a California computer enterprise, to adapt some of his own typeface designs for electronic typesetting. He also served as a member of the executive committee of the Friends of the Dartmouth Library, and in 1986 and 87, he served as its chair. He died the following year at the age of 40. I would like to read the following quote from Stephen Harvard. "The lettering craftsman is apt to be a perfectionist. He is likely to have a crystal clear alphabet somewhere in his mind, a perfect, proportionate set of images that shine with Pythagorean light. All of his work in the real world of ink, paper, copper, steel, stone will be an attempt, with varying degrees of success, to approach the ideal unseen letter forms. He is a craftsman who shares something with the artist as well as the mathematician. It is his trade, as well as his joy, to weigh form and proportion in his mind." End of quote. Before turning the podium over to Wan Chung, who is one of our Book Art Workshop letterpress instructors and also Dartmouth class of 1973, to introduce our speaker, I'd like to thank Lavinia Laskow in the library administration for all her efforts with the countless details in organizing today's lecture and reception, which will follow. Laura Barrett, who's standing right there in the back, director of the library's education and outreach program, for coordinating many of the parts of the planning for today's program. Dennis Grady, our web support and graphic arts specialist, and Stephanie Wolf, Assistant Conservator of Preservation Services, for the installation of the exhibit in the Baker Main Hall, which I hope you will all see after the talk. And finally, to thank Wan Chung, as well as Tom Strong, class of 1960, and John Hill, whose ideas and inspirations culminated in today's lecture, as well as the curation of the exhibit that you will see afterwards. We are grateful for all, and it is a pleasure now to introduce Juan Chung. Juan.
Thank you, Dean Horrell, and thank you all for coming to today's event. I hope you've had a chance to see the exhibit in the main hall of Baker Library on the design work of Alvin Eisenman. There will be a reception in that hall after the talk, so you'll have another chance to see the show, especially after you've heard today's speaker. For this year's Stephen Harvard Memorial Lecture, we have invited Douglas Scott to come and talk about Alvin Eisenman and his relationship to the development of the modern graphic design profession in the post-World War II period. We invited Doug because he is not only a former student of Alvin Eisenman at the MFA program at Yale, but he also served as a teaching colleague for many years before Alvin retired in 1990. He serves as a senior critic at the Yale School of Art, and also serves as a senior critic at the Rhode Island School of Design, where he has also taught for many years. More recently, he has joined the adjunct faculty at Northeastern University, where he now teaches design-related courses. In spite of all this teaching, Doug's professional career is centered on public television work. He joined WGBH in Boston shortly after graduating from Yale and worked there until 2009, serving most recently as GBH's creative director. In addition to his public television work and his teaching, Doug has also been involved in curating and designing numerous exhibitions on all aspects of design. And on top of that, and perhaps most relevant to us here today, Doug has delivered hundreds of lectures on all aspects of design, and in particular on graphic design history, which is why we're very pleased to have Doug here to deliver this year's Stephen Harvard Memorial Lecture. So please welcome Doug Scott.
And before he begins, I need to remind folks we are being filmed at this moment, so including you. And so if people are coming by there, to just try to get below the camera.
It's kind of warm. I'll take off my coat. So thanks a lot for those introductions. I'd first of all like to thank Jeffrey Orrell of the library for arranging this exhibit of Alvin's work in the cases in the entry hall, and also for allowing me to speak today. I also wish to thank Juan Chung for inviting me to speak. I have known Juan since the fall of 1973, when he arrived at Yale, fresh from Dartmouth. We have taught together, and I admire not only his teaching, but also his prodigious output of excellent design work. I'm happy that Alvin's daughter, Sarah, and her husband, David Godine, could be here. I'm also very honored that Alvin's wife, Hope, could be with us today. Thanks to all of Alvin's students I see in the audience. In fact, I know there's some of you here I don't know, but there's a lot that are. I'd like all of you who are Alvin's student to raise your hand. Wow. Excellent, thank you. Alvin Eisenman, Dartmouth class of 1943, was a giant in the field of graphic design. He created and nurtured the first graduate program in graphic design. One could say that the type shop in the basement of this building, which some of you will see or have seen, that this was the beginning or the foundation of Yale's program, because this is where Alvin first began to do letterpress printing. Alvin ran the Yale program for 40 years. He was also president of the American Institute of Graphic Arts in the early 1960s and received the organization's highest award, the AIGA Medal. In order to tie together Stephen Harvard, for whom this annual lecture is named, Alvin Eisenman and Ray Nash, teacher of both Harvard and Eisenman, I will read something which Stephen Harvard wrote about Nash. Ray Nash's students were apt to get more than they bargained for. They came for instruction, but left, as likely as not, with a way of life. That was his greatest strength, the vision to disclose a kind of work so rich and vital as to transcend a mere profession, a kind of work that was a way of living in the world, a way of making rather than consuming culture. The success of his students in the workaday world certainly had roots in his realistic approach to printing. Ray Nash's workshop was no ivory tower. I'm having trouble with this type, or ink or press, a student might say, but only once. The rejoinder was, if trouble bothers you, you are in the wrong place. These words by Harvard about Nash could have easily referred to Alvin Eisenman, who studied with Nash from 1939 to 1943 here at Dartmouth. Ray Nash graduated from the University of Oregon in 1928 and came to Dartmouth as a teacher in 1937 and retired in 1970. Between 1960 and 70, he was director of Dartmouth Publications. He attended Harvard University under the guidance of Paul Sachs and Jacob Rosenberg. Nash was best known for his editorship of the influential journal Printing and Graphic Arts, published by and printed at the Stein Press in Lunenburg, Vermont. Most importantly, Nash was a founder of Print Magazine with William Rudge in 1940. In 1967, Ray Nash gave a talk at the Boston Public Library in which he discussed his approach to teaching graphic arts to undergraduates at Dartmouth. His program included book design and illustration, prints and printing, and an advanced graphic arts workshop which allowed concentrated study in seminar or studio. Nash stated, "In this way, we have the means of holding on to a good man for at least 4 terms. This work, coupled with a senior fellowship devoted to a large graphic arts project or a summer internship at the Stein Press, offered a life full of making and learning among prints and books. How can the student escape? Who would want to?" Nash wrote. Since you can see Alvin's design work in the fine exhibit in the hallway, I am here to give some context to the changing profession of American graphic design in the years prior to World War II, and to show you the work of those assembled by Eisenman to teach in the first graduate program in graphic design. Their work reflects the high quality of American graphic design in the 1950s. The world of book design in the United States had a number of expert practitioners in the 1920s and 30s. Among them, Bruce Rogers, who had worked for the Riverside Press since the 1890s in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He set the standard of typographic excellence and adventurous use of formats, sizes, paper, and ornament. He was typographical advisor to the Harvard University Press, as well as the Cambridge and Oxford University presses in Britain. His typeface Centaur is considered by many to be the most beautiful Roman of them all. The quality of mass-produced books had improved greatly. Here we see the 1930 Moby Dick, designed by William Kitteridge of the Lakeside Press, and Candide of 1929, designed by Elmer Adler of the Pinson Press. Both of these were illustrated by Rockwell Kent. The first time I ever heard the names I've just told you was across the table from Alvin Eisenman. At Yale, the preeminent designer was Carl Purrington Rollins, who had joined the Yale Press in 1918 and would stay over 30 years, thus becoming an early advisor to Alvin when he joined the Yale Press in 1950. One of the most well-known designers of the 20s and 30s was Thomas Maitland Cleland. Not only was he a designer and illustrator of books, but also designed advertisements for General Motors, Cadillac automobiles, and publications for the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He also designed the format of the inaugural issue of Fortune magazine in 1930. And lastly, in this pantheon of traditional typographers is William Addison Duiggins, advertising designer, illustrator, calligrapher, type designer, book designer, and marionette maker. This is his book, this is his book, Rabelais from Gargantua and Pantagruel. His blend of classical typography, meant to be read, and stencil decorations was clearly in step with the Art Deco period between the wars. The majority of his book work was done for the publisher Alfred A. Knopf, where he would create the binding designs using his calligraphy and color combinations inspired by Asian prints. His type designs, most notably Caledonia, Electra, and Metro, are still popular. The model of excellent typography by Dwiggins, Rogers, and Rollins has continued in the work of the Steinauer Press, David Godine Publishers, and many university presses seen in the work of Richard Hendel, Richard Eckersley, and Will Powers. Looking at the other world besides book design, advertising and commercial work, America was seeing a new way to communicate, less dependent on metal type accompanied by line art. This example was done by Lucien Bernhard, the German master of object posters, which began in 1905. In the 1920s, he emigrated to New York, but found the advertising establishment uninterested in his colorful, minimal text posters. He began designing typefaces until the USA caught up with him in the 1930s. This startling full-page ad was done by the French designer A.M. Cassandre. It appeared in Life magazine in 1938. It features a stunning airbrushed illustration of a glass of pineapple juice floating in the Hawaiian moonlit scene with just enough text. Now, I have a story to tell you about this because I have shown this for years in classes and talked about the coming of an airbrushed aesthetic to American advertising, and I was always stunned that there was so little text in this ad, because most American advertising at this time was pretty dumbed down advertising that tried to shame people into doing things. So the story I'm going to tell you is what I finally found on the opposite page of this when I bought Life magazine from 1938 and saw it was across the page. First of all, you will see there's a story about some of the big tennis stars of 1938. But then, all of a sudden, you look at the left and you see a girl holding the ad in her hand. And it says in the text, "Mother, this picture makes me awfully thirsty for a big glass of gold pineapple juice." And then down below, are enjoying the juice. And they're also showing you the can, which most American advertising always had a picture of the product in the ad. But that one, other one did not. So now we see the can. And then the mother says, "Mom, this tastes good. Let's pretend we're in Hawaii." Now, for me, this is a watershed ad because what it really means, I think, is that the American advertising establishment was taking a chance on Cassandra's new advertising idea. And they were not sure that the American public would get it. And so they had to put these other ads in the strip on the other side to make sure that they did get it. Next is another fresh advertisement by Cassandra for the Container Corporation of America, a paper box manufacturer. It is one of many for Container Corporation done by European immigrants, all art directed by Egbert Jacobson, who was the art director of that company. The spread of a 1935 Vogue magazine, art directed by M.F. Aga, represents a radical change in magazine design, an embrace of negative space, and more importantly, the design of a spread as one field, not two separate pages. Both Aga and Alexei Brodovich, working at Harper's Bazaar, pioneered a radical use of photography, drawings, and sans serif types in the mid-1930s. During the Depression and the Dust Bowl devastation on the plains, the United States government funded a program under the auspices of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. This program funded work in the areas of art, music, and theater. Each event or project was publicized by design work by a subsidized poster designer. The designer in charge of the New York district was Richard Flotta, who had studied at the Bauhaus. You will note several aspects of this poster: the use of Futura black, a stencil typeface from Germany, the geometric stylization of the person holding the poster and a paintbrush, and the dynamic angled typography influenced by Italian Futurism. Here is another WPA poster for the Federal Theater Project. It is a production of a George Bernard Shaw play. Note the angled composition and the rectangle organization of the lettering, as well as the simplified this is like a theremin. Good? I don't know. Well, I'll just plow right on here. Okay. Museums began to recognize the development in graphic design, which had been named graphic design by W.A. Dwiggins in a Boston newspaper article in 1922. A British book of 1929 and an American book by Leon Friend of 1939 also used the term graphic design in their titles for the first time. This book cover, designed by Bauhaus student and teacher Herbert Mater in 1938, after he had emigrated to the United States, was the catalog for America's first organized look at Bauhaus work at the Museum of Modern Art. The USA also began to see simplified European-influenced work by homegrown American designers. This poster by Lester Beale in 1937 is to encourage farmers to connect to the newly erected electrical grid, thereby giving the farmer access to water provided by electrical pumps. This is also the time when the United States became an urban nation for the first time. It means more than 50% of the people lived in the cities. A young New York designer, Alex Steinweiss, revolutionized the design of record covers. First the 78 RPMs, and soon thereafter 33 RPMs, attracting young buyers with their illustrated covers. Previous to this, most of the record companies had very plain colored covers, occasionally with a texture. The American effort in promoting participation in World War II propaganda, higher production, seen here in this poster designed by Charles Coiner and illustrated by the French immigrant Jean Carlou. This poster by Swiss immigrant Herbert Mater encourages participation in civil defense. And in this poster by Italian immigrant Leone, compels Americans to fund and honor those who constructed PT boats. The stars are the welders. This brings us to the post-World War II period and Alvin Eisenman. He had entered the Army and had been assigned to design field manuals. This makes sense, you think, but it's not how the military usually works. As I enlisted in the Army Reserve after graduating with a degree in architecture, I was assigned to be a tank mechanic. But because of a typical Army foul-up, I was reassigned to become a draftsman and cartographer, something I was good at doing. Alvin and I laughed about this many times. After Alvin left the Army, he got a job designing books at McGraw-Hill, which we'll see in the hallway, one of the largest publishers in New York. Because of a joint publishing project of the works of James Boswell, Alvin visited Yale and Carl Purrington Rollins, designer at the Yale Press. Rollins was looking for a replacement. Alvin was interested. Simultaneously, the Yale School of Art, America's oldest, dating from 1864, was undergoing a change. The university, under the guidance of Dean Charles Sawyer, was trying to invigorate the arts at Yale. Alvin's arrival at the Yale Press and a recommendation from Ray Nash at Dartmouth suddenly resulted in an additional responsibility for Alvin teaching typography and book design in the art school. Simultaneously, Sawyer had hired Josef Albers, a painting of his, who had taught at the Bauhaus and for the last 17 years had been teaching at Black Mountain College in North Carolina. It's almost impossible to think about he was at Black Mountain 3 years longer than the Bauhaus actually lived. Black Mountain College was an experimental school whose faculty and students include Joseph and Annie Albers, Buckminster Fuller, Robert Motherwell, Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly, John Cage, Merce Cunningham, and most importantly, Alvin's wife, Hope. Josef Albers, for the fall of 1950, reorganized the school into sculpture, painting, and graphic arts. I have a little treat to show you here. This is an actual piece of graphic design done by Josef Albers in 1959. He did several album covers. Yale, having a close relationship to London's Royal College of Art, changed the term graphic arts to graphic design soon thereafter because the Royal College had done it. Albers knew the designer Alvin Lustig since his summer class, Alvin's summer class, at Black Mountain College in 1946. This is an issue of Design magazine designed by Alvin Lustig, who was a well-known book and book cover designer, extremely interested in design education. One of his book covers. Lustig had taught in California and had formulated a design program for the University of Georgia, as well as the University of North Carolina. And he had taught both at the Art Center School in Southern California, as well as the University of Southern California. At Yale, he taught from 1951 to his death in 1955. Here are some of his other book covers, and an exhibition postcard of a show of his. Dean Sawyer and Alvin Eisenman had announced the new graduate program to the design world at the first Aspen Design Conference in the summer of 1951. This conference was funded by the Container Corporation president, Walter Pepke. One of the organizers of the conference, designer Leo Leone, art director of Fortune magazine and editor of Print magazine, was invited to be a visiting critic in Yale's new program. Here's one of his covers and another cover of a Fortune in the 1950s, and then a cover of Print magazine. One of my favorite pieces of Leone is this little piece done for the Museum of Modern Art, and I always ask the students, do you understand what these forms are trying to tell you? And eventually one student will raise their hand and say, they're Roman numerals. It's 25. Another giant in the American design world, who I've mentioned previously, Lester Beale. He had been the first American-born designer to be honored with a show at the Museum of Modern Art. He was also an early teacher at Yale. He had established a design practice with a studio in Connecticut. This is some pages from one of his reports for Connecticut General, as well as the logo. He was trained in economics at the University of Chicago, and he had established relationships with many major corporations doing identity, publication, and package design. Beer packages don't look this good anymore. The next teacher inspired awe in everyone whom he confronted. Alexei Brodovich, Russian-born, worked in Paris in the 1920s for Debonnier and Peignot. He was art director of Harper's Bazaar from 1934 to 1958. Here are 4 spreads, and one of my favorite spreads. The thing I love most about this, and I've recently found this actually in a copy printed in color, so I'm going to have to make a new slide, is the amazing sense that at the top of the spread, and it is a spread, absolutely, is that you are in a 3-dimensional world, and by the time your eye makes it down to the bottom, you are in a 2-dimensional world with the type on a white field. He also designed 3 issues of Portfolio magazine, a magazine with no advertising and some of the most compelling compositions you will ever see. A cover. Brodovich began his American life in Philadelphia in 1930, teaching at the Pennsylvania Museum School, now the University of the Arts. He moved to New York, teaching at his design laboratory, which he described as, quote, the aim of the course is to help the students discover their individuality, crystallize their taste, and develop a feeling for the contemporary trend by stimulating a sense of invention and perfecting a technical ability. This is a spread from Portfolio. One of Alvin's most important early additions to the faculty was Herbert Mater, Swiss photographer, designer, and photomontagist. Mater had worked in California with Charles and Ray Eames and had done photographs for many magazines, including Fortune, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar. In Europe, Mater had worked with Leger, Cassandra, and Corbusier, His major clients were the Guggenheim Museum, Knoll Furniture, and the New Haven Railroad while he was teaching at Yale. This is a cover for the Guggenheim. An advertisement that ran in the New Yorker, among other magazines, for Knoll Furniture. The New Haven Railway logo, still in use today on the commuter lines out of New Haven. Mater and Alvin cemented the relationship between graphic design and photography as the twin pillars of the program, a symbiotic relationship which lasted decades. When I was a student there from 72 to 74, it was essential that I had an ability and an understanding of graphic design and photography. In 1965, Alvin finally persuaded the photographer Walker Evans to join the faculty. I'm going to show you two pictures from the 1930s, 1936. Evans was one of the Farm Security Administration U.S. government photographers who had documented the American South during the Depression. Evans had a long relationship with Fortune magazine from the mid-1930s and was an editor of that magazine from 1945 to 65. If I have been describing a design all-star team assembled by Alvin with the help of Dean Sawyer and Josef Albers, by 1956, Alvin discovered the Babe Ruth, the Lou Gehrig, and the Ted Williams of his team. The first of these was Paul Rand, who distinguished himself in many areas of design: advertising, book cover design, publication, and identity design. This is an early ad for Urbach's department store, which really had a completely different idea about how an image and typography worked in a large newspaper ad. This is one of the most outstanding ads that Rand has ever done. It's conceptually extremely strong. This ad was done in the major newspapers of New York. It was aimed at one person. And this is Morse code, as you can see. And the text says, "To the executives and management of the Radio Corporation of America, RCA." And then it has everybody's name right here. But there's only one person that really counted on this list, and that was Brigadier General Sarnoff, who was the president of RCA and had been a telegrapher since he was a young boy. And so Rand and William Bernbach, who actually wrote this ad with Paul Rand, took a look at this thing and said, we know how to get Sarnoff to read this ad. We are going to put it in Morse code. And of course, that's exactly what happened. And then it goes on to say, gentlemen, there is a package that's being sent directly to your office. And this was a proposal from William Weintraub Advertising, which says advertising right here, to try to get the RCA account for that ad agency. What's amazing, of course, it's so simple. The CBS, or so RCA, and then using the same dot and dash of the Morse code to make the exclamation point for evidence. Rand had also demonstrated his thinking and writing ability with the publishing of his book, Thoughts on Design, which has recently been republished by Chronicle Books in paperback. He went on to write 3 more books in the 1980s and 90s. One of my favorites, a book of the writings of Czesław Miłosz, a Polish writer that speaks to the idea that governments were suppressing people. Not only does it work as a wonderful piece of graphic design that attracts you to the book cover, but then when you look closely, you begin to see the details that were always present in Rand's work. The fact that there is no mouth, that the lines that you see here are like bars of a jail, and even the eyes are little voice balloons, but of course they've been covered up so you can't hear. And of course, I mentioned his identity work. There are 2 examples I'll show you here. First, IBM on the top, an early example of the IBM logo and how it was used, and the later example once he started using the horizontal lines. Next up, after Rand, Bradbury Thompson from Topeka, Kansas, whose work was an enticing mix of exquisite typography mixed with exuberant compositional form. He had done publications for the Office of War Information during World War II and was art director of Mademoiselle, as you see here. Another one of my favorites to show. First of all, he had modernized the masthead of the magazine using a sans serif. But here, a remarkable thing that he did so many times was to take an old piece of graphic design, in this a woodcut of an old dress from the 19th century, and then juxtapose it with the new fashion of 1950. And what you see here is the scale change, which is so important in this thing, and the fact that he has printed that old woodcut in red, which matches the woman's hat and lipstick. It doesn't get any better than this. He was also art director of about half the magazines that came called Westvaco Inspirations from the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company. This is one of my votes for the most influential series of magazines in the 20th century graphic design. Brad Thompson's yearly Christmas book series for Westvaco was stunning in its detail. This is the American Cookery book by Amelia Simmons from the 18th century, here transferred into a modern idiom by Brad Thompson, again with exquisite typography. And his tour de force, the Washburn College Bible. This is a Bible that's entirely phrase, and so each of the phrases has been stopped and then go to the next line. It's one of the first books set in the typeface Saban, because Brad had met Jan Tschichold here when he was visiting the school, and Alvin, of course, got them together and talking, and before you know it, that typeface was being used for this, one of the most important books of the 20th century. And finally, he also designed more than 70, probably closer to 80 stamps for the U.S. Postal Service, and also had many of us design stamps. Many people in the room here probably designed stamps for the Postal Service because of Brad's intercession. The third of the long-time faculty was the Swiss teacher and designer Armin Hofman, who came to Alvin's attention through the introduction of Herbert Mater. Hofman represented not only his own work and his own teaching, but also the strongest and most coherent body of national work in the world at that time, and that was Swiss graphic design. Swiss constructivist design and typography was developed at the crossroads of two superhighways of influence in the 1920s and 30s. The east-west road of Russian constructivism of El Lissitzky, Polish and German work of Strzeminski, Tschichold, and Schwitters, and the De Stijl work of the Dutch Theo van Doesburg. And the other axis, the north-south road of German and Czech work of the Bauhaus and Ladislav Sutnar, through Swiss work of Max Bill and Walter Ballmer, to the northern Italian work of Antonio Boggeri. Hofman, whose lyrical posters merged image and intuitively positioned typography, was a master teacher of drawing, color, lettering, and design. I experienced this not only as his student, but also as his teaching assistant in both color and lettering classes. Hofman's presence and commitment led to more teachers with training from his school in Basel, Switzerland. Notably, Dan Friedman, Inga Druckery, Philip Burton, and Lorraine Ferguson, who many years before had been an undergraduate design student at Yale. This slide is from the design firm Schermayeff and Geismar. By the late 1950s, Yale's first grad students were leading the graphic design world from London to New York. These two examples are from Schermayeff and Geismar, whose firm still excels. So these were the teachers who had established the content structure and rigor of the first graduate graphic design program in the 1950s. I do not want to forget the importance of three other long-term teachers who began as students and were asked to teach. First, Norman Ives, who graduated in 1952, an artist, designer, and business partner of Cy Silman in a printing company who produced prints for Josef Albers. Secondly, John Hill, who taught photography beginning in 1960 and is the epitome of a photographer who has merged the art, craft, and profession of photography at its highest level. And he is a graphic designer of the first rank. And of course, he is here today. Thanks for coming, John. And the third, Chris Pullman, who graduated in 1966, began mixing teaching and professional work, and is still teaching at Yale 49 years later. He has been my most important mentor. I worked with Chris for 34 years, and he is also here today. Thanks, Chris. And finally, I do not want to leave you with the impression that Alvin engaged the clutch and started the contraption, sat back and watched it run. This image is done by Paul Rand, but I think it sums up many of the feelings that I've been talking about. Alvin was, for almost all of us, our most important teacher, focusing on typography, history, technologies, with liberal doses of literature, economics, science, architecture, music, agriculture, and on and on. He was our connection to every department at Yale, various museums, design firms, bookstores in New York and other cities around the world. Whatever your interest, Alvin had a connection. He was interested in absolutely everything of substance. Alvin was genuinely interested in all his students. This made conversations with him always fruitful and interesting. Every semester, he brought in a variety of people to talk to us, show us work, challenge us. In my 2 years, I most remember Wolfgang Weingart, Ken Hebert, Jacqueline Casey, Rudy Bass, Keith Goddard, Dorothea Hofman, and the animators Faith and John Hubley. Alvin's criticism was commonsensical and usually led to so many other opportunities. He made a special connection to each one of us. In closing, I wish to list some of the many accomplishments of Alvin Eisenman and his establishment and caring of the Yale Graphic Design grad program. Alvin saw that the graphic design program must be integrated into the life and organization of Yale University and its many departments. He valued the close relationship between graphic design and photography. He embraced technological change and was not only an early adapter, but also an eager participant in the development of advancements in printing, papermaking, typesetting, and the use of computers. He instilled in his students a love of typography, art, printing, image making, and learning, the joy of doing a good job. The Yale graduate program became the model for what MFA programs could be and have become. So many of Alvin's students have spread out across the world into every major design program as teachers and into the design firms and corporations as designers, art directors, and design managers. Alvin's impact over the past 65 years has been unrivaled. Alvin usually carried a briefcase filled with books, train schedules, and notes. My fellow students and I always talked about what we saw in his briefcase when he popped it open in the morning. My favorite day was the discovery that inside he had one book, the Penguin paperback of Notre Dame de Paris, better known as the Hunchback of Notre Dame, set in 15th century France. When I asked Alvin just before class about this, he began the class with a discussion of the power of print over the power of the Catholic Church. After 45 minutes of a long string of connections, he brought us into the 1970s, leaving us with the power and responsibility we were being offered as graphic designers, editors, and shapers of communication. Not only did Alvin prepare us for a life of professional work, he often used his many connections to help us find a way into jobs. Alvin believed in bringing a variety of students into the program from many different academic and work backgrounds, regardless of their graphic experience. Alvin was such a good teacher, truly an inspiration, that I try to emulate him every day as a teacher for the last 40 years of my life. Thank you.